Alright, welcome everyone for the last day of this English week. Today we will only have one conference. It's really the last one of the week, so please be attentive. This conference will be from Leo Desmond and is going to be about Python shortcode. So I was going to present to you how you can do it. So please welcome Leo warmly and enjoy the conference.
Okay, do you hear me? Great. Um, okay, so welcome everyone to Python Shortcode 101, or how to shorten your code in a totally unreadable way for no reason other than the satisfaction of beating your opponent by one single character. Oof. Um, so I'm Leo. I'm a first year student at the NCBS engineering school, and I'm studying cybersecurity. I'm one of the organizers of the Hero CTF, and I'm a CTF player myself. And what I've loved the most in IT is programming and pen testing. Um, so first, what is shortcode? It's a programming discipline um, where the goal is to create the shortest payload possible. It actually hasn't really any real applications, any real life application. A few years back, when base storages were real smaller, programmers had to be aware of the space the program would take on a hard drive. It was, for example, the case for the first rockets that were launched. The storage space and the computing power were really low, so you had to keep that in mind. Today, one application could be while pen testing, if you have a server-side template injection and you have to inject Python code, you can sometimes be limited by the input size, so you have to limit the number of characters. But that's actually it. So the biggest application is actually just competition and fun. Um, so how did I learn about shortcode? How did I practice it, and how can you practice it? There is a French platform called Coding Game that offers a lot of programming challenges. And one of the most common programming challenges is the Clash of Code. Uh, Clash of Codes are 15-minute long programming challenges where you are competing against 7 other players. There are 3 different game modes that appear randomly. The fastest mode, where players have to solve programming tasks, sorry, and the first one to solve it wins. Reverse mode is very similar to the fastest mode. The only difference is that you don't have a clearly stated task. You have to deduce what you have to program depending on a bunch of inputs and their associated outputs. So you have to deduce what's going on in between. And the final game mode that we will be interested in here today is the shortest mode. Um, you have a clearly stated task, but the winner is not the first one to solve it. It's the one who has the shortest payload in the end. And the short payload is counted in characters. So you can actually choose any language you want. But if you want to be efficient in shortest, I would not recommend to code in languages like C++ or Java. Python is actually widely used, um, but you might be careful. You might have to be careful if competing against players that are coding in JavaScript or Ruby. Those are languages that are particularly efficient in shortcode. So that's where we Python players um, have to be very resourceful. So what are we going to cover today? I'm mainly going to give you some tips and tricks that that can be very commonly used. So if you do some shortcode competitions, those tips and tricks are almost always usable. Um, so we're going to cover comprehension lists, how to put if-else statements in a one-liner, um, how to optimize your indentation. We're going to talk a little bit about unpacking iterators. That's maybe the most complicated notion we're going to see today. So we're just going to scratch the surface. We'll talk a little bit about appending, how saving a function in a variable can make you win some press characters, and finally, we're going to talk about a few Clash of Code specifics that you might not be always able to use depending on the platform where the competitions take place. So the presentation is going to be overall very technical, so a lot of code reading. So you'll have to be very careful about what I'm going to show you. So first of all, what is a comprehension list? As you can see here, these two code blocks are doing exactly the same. They're creating a list from integers from 0 to 6. So in the first way to do it is to create an empty list, iterate through a range iterator from 0 to 6 and append the number to the list. That's the first way to do it. The second way to do it would be using a comprehension list. So it's a one-liner syntax where you iterate through the same iterator as previously, but you are just selecting the I and putting it in the list. I'm going to show you a few examples that's clear for you. You can add an if condition to your comprehension list. So in this example, we are only keeping numbers that check this condition. So the condition is I mod 2 equals to 1. So it means we are keeping only odd numbers. So we iterate through 0 to 6. 0 doesn't match this condition because 0 mod 2 equals 0. So we don't keep it. Next in row is 1. 1 checks this condition, so we keep it, etc., etc. Here's a little trick you can use as well that doesn't have to do anything with comprehension list. If you want to check for even and odd numbers, or in general, if you're using mod 2, you know that something mod 2 would always output 0 or 1. So if you're looking for something that equals 1, you can just check is greater than 0. And finally, using the same logic, you could totally remove the right side of the expression, since in Python, if you are checking for booleans, what's the case here? 0 is the same as a false boolean, and any other number would be the same as a true boolean. So I mod 2, if it equals 1, it's the same as if it returns true, and will also have the same output. Here's one more example with comprehension list that's very important, is if you want to add a else statement to your if, the syntax changes. So you can see here, I have my if statement, it's placed after my my loop. Now it's placed before because I'm using the else statement. That's a little bit illogic, but you have to keep it in mind. So here, for example, I'm doing the opposite of previously. I'm keeping only even numbers, and odd numbers are having a modification before being kept. So I'm iterating through the same numbers as before from 0 to 6. If there are even numbers, I'm keeping them as they are. If they're odd numbers, I'm doing the number times 10. So 0 is an even number, I keep it as it is. 1 is an odd number, I'm doing 1 times 10, etc., etc. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but you see here I was able to remove a few spaces. So between the number and the statement 4, the keyword 4, sorry, between the 0 and the keyword else, I've been able to remove the space 2. But I'll be back to that a little bit later to explain the conditions where you can remove or not spaces in one liner. The final example, just to show you that you don't have to iterate through a range iterator, you can iterate through a simple string. So here I'm keeping every letter that is in uppercase. So I'm looping through the string. I take every letter one by one. If the letter is in uppercase, I'm keeping it so where it's output this list. So that's it for comprehension list. You really should know about it because it's reused in shortcode competitions. If else one-liners, so you had a little look about it here before in the comprehension list. So the idea is just to remove the standard if-else syntax. So if a condition, return carriage, something to do, else return carriage, something to do, is to put everything on the same line. So this basically says I want to return hello, the hello string, if this condition matches, and if it don't, then I want to return goodbye. So that's what's going on here. X equals to 1, so 1 isn't superior to 1, isn't greater to 1, sorry, so we're outputting goodbye. So it works for an assignment, it works for an addition, so it's quite the same here. It also works if you're calling a function. So you can see here that we return hello is exactly the same line, but just put in a return statement. So when called with 0, it outputs goodbye because 0 isn't greater than 1. When called with 2, 2 is greater than 1, so it outputs hello. And finally, last example, you can also use it in a print statement, for example, depending on what you want to print. So as I told you before, I'm going to go back to when you can remove spaces in a one-liner. So you see here, I was able to remove a lot of space. So I was able to remove this space right here, this space right here, this one here, and this one here. So the only one remaining is the one between the if and the x. How is that? You can remove spaces between quotes and brackets, for example. There are others, but that's the main ones. And any other character. And you can do it in reverse, so any other character followed by a bracket or a quote can be removed. So that's the case here. I have some character and then a quote, I can remove the spacing. And the particular case you won't always think about is between a number followed by keyword. So it's the case here. I have a 1, it's followed by a Python keyword, and I was able to remove the space. So you have to be careful with that. If if you do that, your code editor will probably underline this with a red line, telling you it's a bad syntax. It's a syntax error. It is not. Python will understand it, but it's not true in reverse. So if you have a Python keyword like else and you put a number right after it, that will not work. So that's what I wrote down here. A letter followed by anything else won't work, and a keyword followed by a number won't work either. So yeah, that's it for the special spaces. One of the most important parts is indentation, because it's really simple to use, and it saves a lot of characters. So that's a dummy function that is written with a normal editor. So by default, most code editors will put a tabulation for every indentation required by Python. So Python is based on indentation. So for every required indentation, it will put a tabulation symbol. But tabulation symbol is by default often 4 spaces. But you can actually reduce it to only 1 space. So you see every time I had a tabulation symbol here, I have now just one space. So here I save three characters. On this line I save 7. So it's really a great deal. I could remove carriage returns. So you can see here, whenever I could, I removed the carriage return. So after the two loops here, I removed it. And you can also remove carriage returns and chain your instructions with a semicolon, like here. You can chain as much as many instructions as you want, as long as there are no loops. So you see here, I removed the return carriages and put semicolons instead here. I removed the carriage return here too, but I will not be able to put the while up here because it's a loop and I cannot do this inside something else. I hope I'm clear. I'm not very sure I'm clear about that, but if you have any questions, ask them. I'll answer them at the end. So now a little word about unpacking iterators. So first of all, what is an iterator? It's simply a Python object that implements the iter function as an X function, but it's not necessarily printable. So for example, a list, a common Python list is an iterator, but a map object is a map iterator is an iterator as well, but it's not printable. So you'll see if you try to print it, it will just print the object's address in your computer's memory. In general, if you're a little bit familiar with Python, an iterator is everything you can loop on. So if you do for I in blah blah blah, this object will be an iterator if that works. Um, so how does unpacking work? Unpacking is this principle. We have on the right, we have an iterator. So I took a list because it's easier to understand that way. And we are assigning the elements of the list to single variables. So after the first line, A will contain 1, B will contain 2, C will contain 3. Here in the second line, it returns a unpacking error because we have more elements on the right in comparison to the elements on the left of the equation. And so Python would know what to do with 4 and 5 integers here. The workaround is to use a start expressions. So that's a little bit the tricky part of unpacking. Using star expression will put 1 in A, B, and 2 in B, sorry, and every element that remains in the C variable, that is a start expression here. I could have done A, comma B, comma a start expression C, and then a D, and would have put the last element in D and only the 3 and 4 in C, but I can only use one star expression per line. Otherwise, Python wouldn't know what to do with it. Here are a few more examples of how you can use unpacking and start expressions. For example, um, if your programming challenge wants you to output a list of elements spaced with every element spaced by a single space character, um, if you have this list, one way to do it would be to call the map function. So for those who doesn't know it, the map functions takes as a first parameter a function and as a second parameter an iterator, and it will apply the function to every element of the iterator and return a map iterator. So in that case, it will transform every integer to a string. And we are going to join this string, so to space every element with a single space. That's one way to do it. You see it's 27 characters long. The other way to do it is just to take your list, unpack it, and print it. And that will give the exact same result with only 9 characters. And finally, last example, if you want to create a list of integers from 0 to 9, you could use comprehension lists, as we've seen before, by using the range method with a 10 parameter. That's 24 characters. In this particular case, you could just hard code the list. It would be 1 character shorter. You could also use a range function that outputs an iterator and transform it to a list using the list method that will take any object and try to transform it to a regular Python list. Or you could use unpacking, like here. Um, this one's a little bit tricky because you need to use that little comma because unpacking will only work to unpack an iterator to a tuple. So just star a equals something will not work because star a is not tuple. But if you put here your comma, it will be a single element tuple. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's the case. That's how it works. So next part will be really short. It is about the best way of appending data to a list. So the regular Python way to append data to a list is you have your list. So here L that contains 1, 2, 3, 4, and we want to append the number 5. We just use the append method. So that's pretty straightforward. The shortcode way would be to create a single element list with the element we want to append, or maybe more elements than one. That doesn't matter. And we use the addition symbol to add it to the previous list. So that its result is exactly the same, but you want some pressed characters. Next up will be saving a function in a variable. So let's take this code. We are using 3 times the print statement, and that takes up to 90 characters. One way to shorten this code is to save the print method to p. So it creates a pointer, so the print method stays the same. But p will now contain a pointer to the print method. And so every time we're going to call p with the right arguments, it will actually call print with the same arguments. And here we win 5 characters. So this can be done with pretty much any function, any Python function. Um, but you have to be mindful that this will not always save some characters. Sometimes we will end up with more characters than you started. For example, in most shortcode competitions, um, you will have to use multiple times the input functions, and this method works with input, but only if you have at least 3 input calls. So with only 2 input calls, you will end up with more characters in the end if using this technique. So always count at the end if you want any characters or not. So finally, I wanted to present 2 Clash of Code specifics. So when I say Clash of Code specifics, you could actually use them in other competitions, on other platforms. It really just depends on how the platform is built and how it works. So let's say you have this input. So you'll have to call 3 times input. First time to get this integer that will tell you have 2 lines to read. And our objective would be to create one list that contains all the elements, except the 2 because the 2 is just a helper. So this is a code we are going to use. We could have just done for e in range of 2 input and add that to the list. We are going to use so unpacking like we saw before, and we're going to use the open method. Open is normally used to read files or write files, for example. If you do open 0 on a Linux machine, you will read on the standard input stream. So here we open it, we read it until it's closed, and then we split every element. And this gives this list. So the list would, the 2 here, the 2 that we have here, disappeared because we're doing an unpacking trick where we're assigning the 2 to a dummy variable that will never be called again. and the rest will be assigned to the A variable. So if you go over the code one more time, we're opening the input stream, reading everything from it, splitting it. So we'll get a list that contains 2A, 1B, 2, C, 3, D, 4. Saving the first element to this variable, so the 2 disappears, and saving the rest to the A list. And the final Clash of Code specific code would be what I call code obfuscation. You have to know that on the platform, one character doesn't have to be 1 byte long. So one technique is to take your payload, um, take the raw data of your payload, so every byte of it, and re-encode it with Chinese character, because Chinese characters are encoded in more than 1 byte. And that's the difference with our regular characters that are 1 byte long. And you are decoding it on the fly at the execution using the exec function. So when using this trick, you can use the Python Golfer website that does it for you. But you have to be mindful that your start payload must be at least 50 characters long, because we are appending data in the front of our payload and at the end. And if your payload is under 50 characters, your golf payload will be longer. So in the example I took here, that's a real code I used during a Clash of Code session. Our entry payload is 136 characters long, and our output payload is 93 characters long. So we want 43 characters doing this. I would actually not recommend doing it too often. So if you're playing against Ruby players or JavaScript players and you have no other way to win, then I would guess it's a fair move. If you're playing against other Python players, it's actually good not to do it, um, because coding game has a great functionality that allows you to show your code to everyone after the game is over. And this is actually the best way to learn new techniques, is actually to just read your opponent's code to see how they've done it, what's the difference with your code, what is better, what's best in either code. So, and if you just try to read your opponent's code, it's just a bunch of random Chinese characters. It won't bring much to anyone. So yeah, that's it for the presentation. I hope it was clear enough, but I'd be happy to answer some question if you have some. And if not, if there's if there's not enough time or you're too shy, you can just contact me on Discord and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. So yeah,
Yeah, my pleasure.
if you have any question, please ask them in the chat. Yeah, seems like your presentation was very clear.
Just go to the resources. Uh, you can actually just Google shortcode on shortcode techniques, but there's actually not a lot of resources out there.
All right, well, this was the end of this English week. Thank you very much for your presence. You've been here for most of those presentations. So let's just thank the students that allowed this to be possible, mostly Leila and all the members of the BDE Braquage. So thank you for bearing with me and my terrible English accent, and have a good weekend and a good holiday.